Good afternoon. My name is Zev Trachtenberg. I'm the director of the Environmental Studies program at the University of Oklahoma, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this live stream of a talk by Tracy Voyles on California's Salton Sea. What I would like to do first, however, is read something that's very important. It's our land acknowledgement that we offer from the University of Oklahoma. So please let me read that to begin with. So long before the University of Oklahoma was established, the land on which the university now resides was the traditional home of the Caddo Nation and Wichita and affiliated tribes. We acknowledge this territory once also served as a hunting ground, trade exchange point, and migration route for the Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, and Osage nations. Today, 39 tribal nations dwell in the state of Oklahoma as a result of settler and colonial policies that were designed to assimilate Native people. The University of Oklahoma recognizes the historical connection our university has with its indigenous community. We acknowledge, honor, and respect the diverse indigenous peoples connected to this land. We fully recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereign rights of all of Oklahoma's 39 tribal nations. This acknowledgement is aligned with our university's core value of creating a diverse and inclusive community. It is an institutional responsibility to recognize and acknowledge the people, culture, and history that make up our entire OU community. So I'm really delighted to welcome you to the first of a series of talks on the topic of environmental justice and environmental health. In a moment, I'm going to turn things over to Garrett Akers, who will be our host and moderator for the conversation today. But I can't hesitate to say two things. First of all, you'll see above me an email address. And that email address is where you should send your comments to. Comments and or questions. You can email them during the event or afterwards. In addition, I'd like to mention that our talk series is integrated with the blog Inhabiting the Anthropocene. You should have received a link to a post that Tracy did that provides some background to this talk. There'll be additional posts, and I welcome you to check out the blog to kind of get the richer story behind the Salton Sea. And I will take the liberty of sending you a link to the blog. With that, I'd like to turn things over to Garrett, and let me introduce him. He's the co-president of the OU Health Sciences Center Environmental and Sustainable Health Interest Group, and was really instrumental in getting this whole series going. So, Garrett.
Thank you, Dr. Trachtenberg. Like he was just saying, my name is Garrett Akers, and I'm a second-year medical student at the College of Medicine, the OUHSC. And additionally, I'm also the co-president of the Environmental and Sustainable Health Interest Group, which is the student-led organization at OU, or the OU College of Medicine, that's interested in the intersection of healthcare and the environment. And I am very excited to be here today, so thank you all for coming. We have with us today our guest speaker, Dr. Tracy Voyles. Dr. Tracy Voyles is an associate professor at the University of Oklahoma, the chair of the Women and Gender Studies Department, and the director of the Center for Social Justice. She is an award-winning researcher, teacher, and expert in the fields of environmental justice, environmental history, indigenous history, feminist theory, and critical race studies. She's written a number of journal articles, essays, and books, including an article in a forthcoming book on today's topic, which is the history of the California Salton Sea. So without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Tracy Voyles.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm really thrilled to be here today. As some of you might know, I'm new to OU. I just arrived in Norman over the summer from Southern California, and I've been getting to know my new home community mostly through Zoom. And so I'm very pleased to have you all here today. I really wish that we were in person. But I hope to be able to meet everybody who is here personally at some point in the future. Dr. Trachtenberg asked me to kick off this series with a talk based on a recent publication of mine. And so that's where the theme comes from. And what I'm going to be talking about today are some of the ways in which my work as a women's and gender studies professor intersects with this project that I've been engaged in for the last on and off for 10-ish years, but really intensively for the last 4 years on the history of California's Salton Sea. So I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank Garrett for the lovely introduction and to Zev for the invitation to participate in what I consider to be a really important series. So collaborations with environmental studies and working with the Inhabiting the Anthropocene group were a major pull in my decision to come to OU. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be doing this kind of work. I want to add briefly to the OU land acknowledgement statement for Oklahoma-based Indigenous nations to say that while I was doing the work that I'm going to present today, I was living and working on Tongva land and doing research on the homelands of the Cahuilla, Kumeyaay, Quechan, and Payom-Cowichan nations. I want to thank the people of those nations for their ecological stewardship and for their continued practices of sovereignty and self-determination in the context of ongoing settler colonialism. So my setting for this research is a place called the Salton Sea. This is the Salton Sea. This is a NASA image of the Salton Sea. You can see the kind of ecological context. It's in Southern California. The line that you notice along to the south of it, sort of bisecting that valley to the south is the US-Mexico border. My setting for this research is the Salton Sea is the largest inland body of water in the state of California. And if you had a chance to read the blog post, you know that it was formed in 1905 by flooding from the Colorado River, which you can see there just to the east of the sea itself. As a body of water in a desert, in one of the most arid desert ecologies in North America, the only reason that the Salton Sea hasn't dried up since its formation in the early 20th century is that it's been used since that time as a repository for irrigation runoff water from the Imperial and Coachella Valley farms. At the moment, it's drying up very, very quickly, which is causing major problems for wildlife, which rely on the sea as a wetland, and for humans who inhale the polluted air when the dry lake bed gets kicked up in windstorms. So you can find a summary of the Salton Sea's early history and some of the major themes of the book and how I grapple with some of the paradoxes and the complexities of studying this deeply strange place on the blog post, which I titled, "How Do You Solve a Problem Like the Salton Sea?" So it's been used as a wildlife refuge for, and one of California's last remaining ecosystems for species, including these. This is the Yuma clapper rail, and the desert pupfish, both of which are on a federal list of endangered species. So it's a matter of wildlife conservation at the same time as the ecological conditions at the Salton Sea are causing pretty devastating environmental threats and harms to wildlife. So the kinds of conditions that create die-offs, like the ones that you see pictured here, or anytime you Google the Salton Sea, these are generally the first kinds of images that come up, kind of place a fine point on questions about whether or not this is an important resource for wildlife that needs to be conserved, or a highly polluted landscape that that isn't helpful as a resource for wildlife. You can see those kinds of debates that get played out in discussions about the Salton Sea. And this is the blog post. So today I want to start with two things as kind of a jumping off point. The first thing is a startling image, and the second thing is an impertinent question. So both are intended as provocations to help us think together about the gender and sexual politics of environmentalism and environmental degradation, which is the basis of a journal article that I recently published in Environmental History that Zev invited me here to talk about today. So in this journal article, I draw analysis from my training in environmental history, as well as in women's and gender history, to think through some of the ways in which gender and sexuality have shaped human relationships to the non-human world, and particularly how normative gender roles orient us toward the environment in different kinds of ways. So the examples that I want to talk about today are drawn from this book project, and the monograph of that project is going to be out in the fall by the University of Nebraska Press. The tentative title is The Settler Sea, but as anybody out there who's published a book knows, your editors have ultimate authority to change that on you at the last minute, so it might come out under a different title. But I'm often asked, as I've been working on this project, what women's and gender studies has to do with the Salton Sea and vice versa, which is an excellent question. And this essay that I'm drawing on for today indicates a partial answer to that kind of question. So first, let's look at the image. This is the image that I want to start with. So this image was created in 2018 when two Navy planes flew over the Salton Sea as a training exercise from a nearby base. So while in midair, the pilots decided to pull a prank, and that prank resulted in these images, which unfortunately can only be described as a sky penis. The radar image that was produced here was tweeted out by a civilian monitor, which then garnered thousands of engagements from Twitter users and prompted coverage from the Navy Times, as well as a number of other media outlets. So I want to point out that these kinds of pranks are not unheard of. Naval officers have been rebuked for at least 3 similar incidents just in 2018 and 2019 alone, which is a pattern that kind of speaks to ongoing and often very troubling problems involving the sexual politics of militarism, which has been a subject studied at length by feminist scholars for decades. To underscore the implications of the prank in terms of sexual politics, one military contractor reported on this incident that when the pilots, quote, penetrated the Salton Sea, it had yet to be confirmed that the sky was able to give consent, end quote, which is, I think, a way of framing this, this incident that we can agree is involves a pretty ugly correlation of the of these kinds of incidents with politics of sexual assault. So at the Salton Sea, the image of the sky penis projected over the desert landscape illustrates an additional kind of problem of thinking about the Salton Sea. It illustrates a general low regard for this region, its inhabitants, and its unique environmental conditions. So the Salton Sea is notoriously disparaged in public discourse. It's generally treated as, in the words of one journalist, a fetid swamp not worth saving. This low regard for the desert area is shaped, for example, by the Navy Times describing the sky penis prank as taking place, quote, high above a Mad Maxian wasteland, end quote, which is not a way that one would want to describe an ecosystem or area for which they had significant respect. The residents here in the vicinity of the Salton Sea are 65% non-white. Many of them are linguistically isolated, economically disadvantaged. They include Indigenous peoples at a number of the federal reservations that exist in this part of Southern California. They involve farm worker communities and a high rate of incarcerated people in the prisons that have come to occupy the rural areas, many rural areas of Southern California, this one included. And what you can see on this map are the military areas as well as native reservations and some of the prisons. All right. Nearly 3/4 of the population in the vicinity of the Salton Sea live well below the federal poverty line. And this contributes generally to the habit of maligning the human and non-human landscape of the desert in a way that treats the Salton Sea and its surrounding environments as a wasteland, an ecological non-entity, barren and uninhabited by people who are considered unimportant. So that's a gesture to my first book, which is called Wastelanding, which is about the ways in which ideas about race and space work together to construct landscapes and peoples as being pollutable. So with regard to the sky penis prank, I'm interested in thinking about this incident as part of a larger history. So one in which white settlers in this part of California have made meaning out of the Salton Sea as a body of water that's only valuable in so much as it supports white masculine settler vitality. This masculine vitality in turn has entailed devastating environmental consequences with impacts on non-human nature and people alike. So through this kind of lens, the image of the sky penis can be understood as an invocation of the sexual politics of environmental degradation. So this brings me to a question that, alongside the image, prompts me to think as a WGS, as a women's and gender studies scholar, and as an environmental historian, about how this can help us reimagine how we think about normative gender roles and our relationships to the non-human world. So the question that I want to pair with this image is manliness bad for the environment? And I named this article and the talk, Toxic Masculinity, as a way of playing off of a phrase that feminist scholars have used to describe the instances in which hegemonic masculinity is constructed so rigidly that its boundaries are policed with coercion, domination, and violence. So using that framework of toxic masculinity, how can we think in concrete terms about the material environmental consequences that are implied with the word toxic? So of course, I'm talking here about normative or hegemonic constructions of masculinity that exist at the intersections of white privilege, able-bodiedness, and in this particular study, settler colonialism. So I'm not really referring here to other kinds of counter-hegemonic embodiments of masculinity. And for more on that, there's a lot of great gender scholarship from gender studies or queer and trans studies. Scholars like Jack Haberson, who writes about female masculinity, or Matthew Hines, who writes about different iterations of trans masculinity. So those are different kinds of interpretations or engagements with masculinity that aren't necessarily involved in this analysis. So although environmental historians have yet to deeply engage with the environmental consequences of sexual power, with some important exceptions, studies in other fields have documented the impacts that gender roles have on the non-human world. So in one particularly well-publicized study, the authors found that people tend to conflate environmentalism with femininity, and that connection makes people who identify with and value hegemonic masculinity, primarily men, less likely to engage in pro-masculine behaviors. In other words, behavioral scientists, sociologists, psychologists, and political scientists have been studying and noting the ways in which hegemonic masculinity is actually one of the many barriers we face as we seek to rectify our dramatic environmental challenges, ranging as large as climate change. So this cleaves to longstanding arguments from feminist political ecologists and some environmental historians that women have been long understood as nature's housekeepers, and that femininity is positively correlated with care for the non-human world, which is a perspective that oversimplifies complex relationships to environmentalism, but generally relegates environmentalism to the feminine sphere. And in fact, some of our most famous men environmentalists, including John Muir, who's depicted here in a political cartoon that was published in San Francisco Call, were ridiculed as part of their environmental work as being, quote, political hermaphrodites for their engagement in environmental advocacy. And this is explicated really in a lovely way by an environmental historian named Adam Rome, who writes about environmentalism as political hermaphrodism. So the image of the sky penis might be startling, and my question about whether masculinity is bad for the environment might seem baldly provocative, but I would argue that they actually help us more deeply understand a history that's particular to the Salton Sea and other places that are facing complex environmental challenges. The Salton Sea's history, as I want to show here today, involves a long story of making masculine meaning out of a landscape and a seascape. A history of visual and textual depictions of the sea is worthless, except to reaffirm white settler manly vitality through the exploitation of the environment. Here, as elsewhere, robust settler men engaging in environmental vandalism has been a constitutive feature of white settler masculinity. So, By the middle part of the 20th century, so the blog post really deals with some of the early history of the Salton Sea, but I want to talk today about the middle decades of the 20th century. So by the 1930s, 1940s, and certainly into the 1950s, the Salton Sea served three primary purposes. So today I'm going to talk about two of them. So the first one that I'll kind of leave to the side for now is that it was used, as it has been since 1907, as a sump for irrigation runoff water from the Imperial and Coachella valleys. This kept the farms from becoming swampy. It drained the salt out of the soil. And particularly after World War II, it served as a drainage system for the deluge of chemical pesticides that farmers were using on their crops. So obviously this first and primary use of the sea entailed extreme and mostly negative consequences for the health of people, wildlife, and the local ecosystem, and in particular for the farm workers who are at the front lines of the deployment of chemical pesticides on farms. So its second and third uses were for tourists and for the military, and those are the ones that I want to talk about. As irrigation water drained into the Salton Sea, tourists flocked here to sunbathe, swim, fish, and boat. Meanwhile, the military was at the same time using it for target practice, dropping thousands of real bombs and dummy bombs into the water, including multiple replicas of the Fat Man and Little Boy bombs that would later go on to destroy the Japanese cities of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Visual representations of the sea played crucial roles in illustrating the gendered meanings of both tourist and military uses of the Salton Sea during these decades. So I want to talk a little bit about the tourism first. During this time, brochures, pamphlets, and postcards that were used to advertise and promote the sea as a tourist destination focused heavily on gender and sexuality, conflating recreation on the Salton Sea often with sexualized femininity and, by extension, robust masculinity. In promotional brochures like one that was circulated in 1955 by the Salton Sea Chamber of Commerce, the fabulous inland sea, as it was described, was illustrated with curvy white women water skiing in bikinis. Meanwhile, fish jumped out of the water to offer their bodies as sport and sustenance to angler fishermen. And the symbolic vocabulary of these brochures, which this one represents here, presumed an audience composed of virile men and others who wanted to please such men. When men did appear in these images, they most often wielded fishing poles, shotguns, and other visual signifiers of phallic masculine power. In the Salton Sea, in one Salton City Chamber of Commerce brochure, men appeared twice, once in the background of a leaping fish, and once as a refined pipe-smoking gentleman floating next to the words vim, vigor, vitality. The brochure reads, quote, "Here on the shores of the Salton Sea, you can live like a king without the necessity and trouble of being one," end quote. What they called nature's magnificent mistake and man's masterful plan would provide kingly resources in the form of alluring women and fish, which were both easy catches in the visual vocabulary of the brochure. The environmental consequences of tourism, which these are a few archival images of the tourism itself. And what you see here is a restaurant that's flooded because of the increase in irrigation water, which was raising the levels of the sea in the 1950s and the 1960s as the farmlands increased their irrigation. So the environmental consequences of tourism were really complex and varied. Tourists brought invasive species and new germs to a delicate desert ecosystem that had been, until very recently, primarily inhabited by indigenous peoples. The state of California was forced at times to institute quarantines to control infectious disease outbreaks or to try to prevent the importation of invasive plant species. In their hotels, restaurants, marinas, and bars, tourists put intense pressure on the water system in a place where fresh water is a precious and irreplaceable resource. And they also needed to get around, for which purposes the counties built miles and miles of roadway out of granite that was blasted from local quarries and laid mostly by incarcerated workers and chain gangs. So as suggested by this kind of imagery, tourism impacted the non-human world primarily via the barrel of a gun and the hook of a fishing pole, but also in very complex other kinds of ways. The various gun clubs to the south of the Salton Sea, hunters decimated wild bird populations in addition to birds that were introduced and imported for that purpose by the Fish and Wildlife Service. The Fish and Wildlife also repeatedly stocked the Salton Sea with fodder for anglers such as corvina and tilapia, which did really well in the Salton Sea's warm and salty water, but were a major threat to the endangered desert pupfish. So like desert brochures, the military's visual meaning making of the Salton Sea rendered it a fungible resource for the development of white settler masculinity, which entailed really concrete and often devastating environmental consequences. So what you see here is an army photograph of the Salton Sea from above during one of the training exercises that happened here in the during World War II. Rather than the robustness of tan skin and well-shaped muscles, this white settler masculinity emerged from bombs, blasts, and bullets, all of which required a target. Here again, the images that the military officials produced provided a key mechanism that made meaning out of these military uses of the Salton Sea. So the Navy first began testing weapons in the sea in the late 1930s. They would skip bombs across the surface and launch torpedoes into the depths below. Throughout World War II, as the military sought a reasonable ecological facsimile of North Africa, more than 1 million soldiers trained for combat in the Salton Sea's northern and eastern borderlands in the Desert Training Center. And then at the old Sandy Beach Naval Station and Naval Auxiliary Air Station near present-day Salton City, the Manhattan Project tested ballistics on the sea's eastern shores. So these various military projects cast these giant wooden structures out into the water, and that's what you see pictured here, that were used for target practice. Some of these are still there. Dummy bombs that they shot into the sea could weigh as much as 10,000 pounds. They were made of concrete, iron, lead, and rocks. Many of them were rigged up with explosives. And in the 1990s, the EPA found that there was good evidence to suggest that these so-called dummy bombs also contained uranium. The military lost any number of fighter planes to the depths of the Salton Sea, including this one. This is an Avenger that was discovered by scuba divers with the Riverside County Sheriff's Search and Rescue Team in 1999. So there are at least 10 Avengers that crashed into the Salton Sea, were never found again, that are still there. At the end of World War II, the newly formed Atomic Energy Commission passed the management of the Salton Sea test base to the Sandia Corporation. So under the administration of Sandia, more than 1,100 bombs were tested in and around the Salton Sea. Sandia's purpose at the Salton Sea test base was to evaluate the drop capabilities of a range of different types of explosives. And then afterwards, they tried to recover the remains of the bombs, but often were unable to, if you can imagine pulling bombs that have been exploded in the Salton Sea up from the bottom. So like the tourist brochures at Salton Sea resorts, images show us how gender roles shaped the military's engagement with the sea. Photographs produced during the Sandia years, together with textual evidence, reveal the sexual politics of bombing the Salton Sea decades before Navy pilots would see fit to etch penises in the sky above it with their airplanes. So these kinds of images that were produced by Sandia privileged men's, most of them scientists, ways of seeing the sea as an enabler for military experiments. Unlike tourist brochures, virile masculinity at the Salton Sea test base was generally represented through images of men themselves, like this one. So these photographs made meaning out of the military's purpose at the Salton Sea by focusing on men's bodies, men's uses of high-tech equipment, and men's relationships to bombs, but not always. So as this front page of the Sandia Lab News illustrates, this is from 1956, women's sexualized bodies represented recreation and leisure as opposed to men's work in what the Lab News here calls the country's smallest navy. So in these kinds of visual representations, men's bodies provide scale and context for bombs and for the operations of bomb tracking equipment. They also suggest support for what feminist theorist Carol Cohn has famously described as the phallocratic missile envy in the culture of post-World War II defense industries. So men posed with bombs, such as in this image, in which a test-based employee embraced a dummy Mark V nuclear warhead before it was shot into the Salton Sea. So his arm here is stretched out to gently embrace the weapon's exterior in a kind of unironic mimicry of a wedding photograph. In other images, men show the operation of the base's high-tech photographic equipment. So their bodies are posed in mid-coupling in these images between man and machine. As opposed to tourist brochures where women and fish signified the allure of the Salton Sea for recreation with few men in sight, here men appeared everywhere. Their bodies made sense of the bombs for viewers, communicating both desire and excitement for this kind of military project in the desert. The Salton Sea came to have meaning in this military context as an object of military men's gazes, filtered through bomb tracking devices or at times through the point of view of the bombs themselves. A bomb's eye view of the Salton Sea rendered it a flattened, featureless plain of dark water, an ideal resource for target practice in the middle of the desert. The men of the Navy and Sandia complied, much to the sea's detriment. Military uses of the Salton Sea as a target entailed a range of different kinds of environmental consequences, many of which you can probably imagine. By 1945, the Navy had so extensively bombed the sea that it decimated a mullet fishery that it had supplied fodder for fishermen for decades. Navy planes transported to the Salton Sea from the Pacific Ocean brought in striped acorn barnacles on their hulls, which was an invasive species to the sea's ecosystem that's really exploded. And now you see barnacles just distinctly cover everything. Some of the beaches there are made entirely out of pulverized barnacle shells. And at the 29 Palms Marine Corps Training Center, the Marines depleted a vast underground water fur, which contributed to the decline of the Agassiz desert tortoise, which is currently classified as threatened under the Federal Endangered Species Act. In addition to bombs rigged up with electronics and encased in heavy metals, the Salton Sea test base dumped motor oil, trash, construction materials, and lots of sewage into the water, and buried disposal tanks with unknown contents along the beach, some of which remained underwater well into the 2010s. So 90 of California's formerly used defense sites that have been marked for needing environmental cleanup are at the area surrounding the sea, and 15 are at the sea itself. The military uses of the Salton Sea during these years also inspired its very own B-grade horror film, which turned on the ideas about the radioactive pollution that likely came from Atomic Energy Commission experiments at the sea, as well as dominant notions about gender and sexuality. So this is the poster for a 1957 film called The Monster That Challenged the World, starring Tim Holt and Audrey Dalton. And in this film, the AEC's or Sandia's radioactive experiments at the Salton Sea caused mollusks to mutate into giant people-eating monsters, because of course it did, who terrorized the tourists that sunbathed on Salton Sea beaches. So true to its genre, these monsters specialized in devouring and terrorizing beautiful young women in particular, as well as couples who were sneaking away for illicit sexual encounters. I'm not going to spoil the ending for you, except to say that the outcome really underscores the general themes that predominate other parts of this gendered history of the Salton Sea. And in particular, that military masculine vitality eventually comes to be reaffirmed against the environmental terrors of its own creation. But I'll leave it there and let you watch it yourself. The film brings together tourist and military uses of the Salton Sea, showing how environmental consequences come to be seen, understood, and overcome, often by doubling down on, rather than mediating, the dominant gender roles that have shaped settler engagements with the Salton Sea since its formation in the early years of the 20th century. So both uses of the sea carried along dramatic material consequences for a unique ecosystem, a sea in a desert, and for the people who call it home. So all of this, so giving context to sky penises, to tourist brochures, men cuddling bombs, giant irradiated mollusks. In each of these examples, meaning about the Salton Sea and its worth emanates through the lens of able-bodied white masculinity. Each example is also attended by the environmental consequences of white masculinity and its engagements with nature. Would-be virile tourists sculpted their muscles in the sea's salty water. Sandia scientists lived vicariously through their bombs, and bored Navy pilots inscribed their own vim, vigor, and vitality into the sky above the sea with their planes, figurative extensions of their own bodies. So throughout this history, masculinity entailed both a crucial meaning-making practice and a seething environmental threat to this fragile ecosystem. So this image of the sky penis puts a fine point on the relationship between settler masculinity and the Salton Sea, a relationship that, as it turns out, has a long history, entailing devastating environmental consequences, as well as settler domination of native land. For environmental historians, the gendered violence that's suggested by this framing underscores often surprising connections between environmental degradation, masculinity, and settler power. At the Salton Sea and elsewhere, environmental vandalism has been a crucial ingredient of constructing white masculinity and sexuality and making meaning out of non-human nature. So I'm going to leave it there and turn it to your questions and to Garrett for mediating those questions. I look forward to answering any and all of them with the time that we have left.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Dr. Voyles, for that presentation. Very interesting. The first question that I have is thinking of the current conditions of the Salton Sea. I've only ever heard it to be described as what is essentially a receptacle for all things bad that have gone into it, where things get concentrated, and that, I suppose, extends both into the literal realm where we're talking about all the lead and uranium that's apparently concentrating there, but as well as, I guess, some of these themes of toxic masculinity or environmental destruction at the behest of the military. So my question is, today, what does that landscape look like today in terms of what's going on?
Yeah, it's a great question. In many ways, the most important one. And that's the question that sort of haunted me throughout the book project, because the years that I was really intensively working on this research have also been the years in which the Salton Sea faces a really and truly existential crisis. So what's happened, as probably everyone knows, California's been facing really devastating and incredibly challenging problems of water shortages and drought for, I mean, on and off for really the last decade and a half to 2 decades. One of the ways in which that's been mediated in this part of California is by negotiating farm to city water transfers, where farmers in the Imperial Valley have sold their water rights to the coastal cities as one of the ways of trying to mitigate these water shortages. What that means is that the water that was going into the farms and then into irrigation canals and into the Salton Sea isn't there anymore. And so that, in combination with increasingly hotter temperatures every year, has meant that the Salton Sea has been evaporating at a very dramatic rate, particularly since 2017. And so at the moment, nobody quite knows exactly what the outcome will be. So in addition to, so I've written a couple of articles about this, and written elsewhere a little bit about how, in addition to the kinds of physical challenges of grappling with this particular problem, there's a larger challenge that it's actually hard to get people to mobilize around the Salton Sea because of exactly what you said. Everybody identifies it as a wasteland, as a place that doesn't seem to have environmental value. It doesn't seem to be inspiring to environmentalists in the same kind of ways as other more quote unquote pristine landscapes are, which makes it even harder for people to come up with solutions. So there have been a number of proposed solutions. Most of them are technocratic in nature, engineering solutions in particular. But what we're confronted with in a macro sense is maintaining a water resource in a desert, where the temperatures often range up to 120 degrees. It's a really devastating problem, and yeah, one that's I think going to be a real challenge for environmental policymakers in the future, in the near future.
I can imagine so, yeah, particularly as you were just saying a moment ago about these elevated temperatures and everything. I saw one of the pictures you had of the Salton Sea had a algal bloom, a massive algal bloom in the middle of the lake, and so I can't imagine that the current conditions there in terms of the usability of that place are very good at all. But hopefully, again, as you're alluding to, I think it is a place that can be remediated because it's absolutely worth being remediated. I have another question for you about the broader theme of justice as it pertains to the Salton Sea. So could you reflect on or tell us, what do you think is the most pressing injustice that's going on there?
It's a great question. So there are a number of studies that have looked at the environmental justice and environmental health conditions in the area surrounding the sea, and have really pointed to, the most urgent sites have to do primarily with environmental health and respiratory health in particular. So the particulate matter and air pollution status of the area surrounding the sea is really quite troubling. Rates of childhood asthma and those kinds of things have skyrocketed and correspond really with the evaporation rates and how much playa gets exposed from that lake bed. So in an immediate sense, that is the primary concern. It's in an area where, as we know, in rural areas all over the country, there's less and less access to quality healthcare resources, particularly for people who are impoverished. So in that sense, it is kind of an immediate and very, very urgent environmental justice and environmental health concern. In a broader sense, I didn't talk much in this talk about the primary argument of the book, but in the blog post, I frame it out a little bit more explicitly. And the argument of the book looks at the Salton Sea as one of our clearest examples of the ways in which settler colonialism refigures landscapes in ways that make the landscapes themselves dispossessive for Indigenous nations. And for me, that's the broader kind of lesson that's entailed in this particular story. So the problem with, scholars have debated forever, just endlessly, about whether the Salton Sea can be better described as human-made or nature-made. And no matter where you fall on that history, whether it was created by the Colorado River, just doing what the Colorado River did, or whether you fall on the side of it being created by some irrigation company men who were making bad choices, there's no doubt that it's been settler maintained since the 1920s. So the Indigenous history of the sea involves really rich environmental knowledge about the desert being flooded and then evaporating, and then floods and evaporation, and those cycles all throughout history. It's that cyclical nature of the sea that's been interrupted and keeps it from being contiguous with that kind of environmental or Indigenous past. So for me, that's the key framing, right, is to think about the sort of micro considerations about how health is being harmed in this very, very local environmental context, but also what it tells us about these broader structures of power and power relations between settlers and Indigenous peoples, large agriculturalists and farm workers, and different kinds of people in the environment. So yeah, it's a great question.
Well, that was a great answer. Thank you. I don't want to let my own intellectual biases show too much, but I am very interested in algal blooms, and it's interesting that you mentioned that these people are being intoxicated by the particulate matter that gets blown off of this lake. And moreover, I think the fact that the people who are being most impacted by that negative health implication are the people who are already being marginalized, the people whose land has already been taken away. It's, I agree, a massive, massive injustice. We had a question, and I encourage questions to keep on rolling in at the email address above my head. We had a question earlier. You were alluding in the post that you made on Dr. Trachtenberg's blog about different kinds of environmentalism. So can you elaborate on that briefly?
Yeah, so as an environmental historian, one of the kind of primary threads in that literature is thinking about the history of environmental politics and environmentalisms. I'm trying to recall what I wrote in the blog about different environmentalisms, and I'm not sure what the person who posed the question is pointing to in the blog post specifically. But in general, one of the themes that environmental historians generally, but me in this book project in particular, are looking at are what we mean when we talk about environmentalisms and what kinds of environmental movements we're thinking about and engaging with when we talk about environmental protections. So generally speaking, the sort of mainstream definition of environmentalism reflects what environmental justice scholars refer to as mainstream environmentalism, or environmentalism that grows out of the tradition of preservationism that was sort of generated in the John Muir era Audubon Society, humans altruistically protecting a pristine nature against incursions from humans writ large. Environmental justice scholars and activists have done a very good work of critiquing that mainstream framework of environmentalism and specifically pointing to the ways in which it's really a white environmental politics. If you tell the story of environmentalisms differently and from more diverse perspectives, you see that it involves much different approaches to human understandings of the environment, human relationships to the environment, and solutions to different human-created problems with regard to environmental relations. So indigenous traditional ecological knowledges, for example, African-American environmentalisms and environmental politics, these have all kind of provided alternative models about what human-nature relations can look like. And I think it gets to kind of the critique, the feminist and environmental justice critique of even talking about the Anthropocene as our main way of engaging with or framing or characterizing human-nature relationships. It abstracts all humans as being the root cause of the environmental problems that the Anthropocene is meant to describe. When in fact, when you look at the kinds of patterns and activities that have produced the environmental conditions that are so troubling to us, that's really rooted in particular kinds of human relationships to the environment that have also involved exploitation and oppression of other kinds of peoples. Right. So different and more diverse environmentalisms have to be a critical part of the story and the equation.
Thank you. Thank you for explaining all that. I think these next two questions that I'll provide from the audience kind of intersect with that answer you just gave already. But someone was asking that they were talking about how you had already mentioned that environmentalism is often seen as being in opposition to masculinity. And this person was saying that that seems to, play out currently in our relationship in the US's political relationships to environmentalism and environmental change. So the question is, how can we get this idea across to lawmakers that environmentalism is important? And I think inherent in their question was the implication that because the way we make policy is very masculinized, is very driven by men, how do we get past that, and how do we make environmental political change?
Oh man, it's such a good question. The easiest way to answer that is to say I'm a historian. I can't really weigh in on the contemporary stuff, but then again, I'm also a WGS scholar, so I kind of have to. I think that it's a key point. I think that tracing the histories of the feminization of environmentalism and environmental politics has had very real consequences for whether or not our policies are actually engaging in environmentalism in a robust way. And I think that the broader problem is a degradation of care work. The idea that to do any kind of care, whether that's care for your relations with the non-human world or valuing care of small children or the elders in our communities, that's not part of the real business of politics, or it's not something that politicians who identify strongly with hegemonic masculinity or toxic masculinity can be seen engaging in. And I think that that's problematic. I think it's a really easy way to dismiss policies that could do real work toward rectifying the harms of climate change and those kinds of things. I think some of the false the false choice binaries that sort of get represented in politics, like environment versus jobs, are actually very gender coded. And that the only way that men engage with the non-human world is by engaging in jobs that dig fossil fuels out of the ground and those kinds of things. I think that more gender analysis of that kind of stuff helps. I don't know that it helps necessarily with getting politicians who identify with hegemonic masculinity so strongly that they don't want to be seen endorsing environmental legislation. I don't know that that's going to help that, but certainly representative and electoral politics sort of matter. And I would say that the ultimate solution to that is to get more people who have a nuanced and engaged respect in relationships in the non-human world to vote and engage in the political process.
I love that. I love that your answer ultimately ends with, we need to get more people involved in politics who respect these sorts of things and get those people to vote as well. Well, thank you for that. That's fantastic. Here's a question that I think takes a much, much broader step back. Someone was wondering, and I think in relation to what we're talking about today, what is inherently wrong, or is there something inherently wrong about white masculinity?
Yeah, it's such a good and loaded question. And my students come to this all the time, with this understanding that, a very kind of an understanding of what feminist scholarship is doing in its critiques, and particularly just the assumption that we're going to say that masculinity or men are bad or wrong, right? And that's not the question that we're really engaged in. So white masculinity is a power structure that accrues power and privilege to certain people over others. Yeah, it's kind of problematic. There's a lot about white masculine culture that's I think can be easy to see value in, absolutely. And I think that one of the hardest things engaging in WGS conversations or feminist theory conversations with folks who are new to the field or new to the critique is that they think that we're talking they think that we're always talking about people and interpersonal interactions, right? When really what we're doing is talking about power structures that organize people's relationships in problematic ways, right? I don't think that a critique of white masculinity necessarily always, or even frequently, is mapped directly onto a critique of white men and their actions and engagements. And all you have to do to see that that's the case is look at the actual history of environmentalism and environmental politics in the United States, right? And the work that white men have done to engage in environmentalism and environmental activism has been really transformative. So the political cartoon of John Muir is actually kind of a quintessential example of that, in that white masculinity as a power structure was policing him, right? And saying that he was stepping outside of his bounds of socially constructed gender normative behavior. There are other ways to critique John Muir. He had deeply racist attitudes toward Native Americans in particular that were really consequential for the way that environmentalism evolved over time. So I think that the best answer to that question is first to say that yes, these things are complex, right? It doesn't mean that there's nothing that can't, that isn't critiquable within that category of white masculinity. But as feminist scholars, we're really interested in the ways in which power relations organize our actions and our attitudes toward each other, rather than critiquing necessarily always, the actions of people themselves. Does that make sense? I guess the best answer to that is, like everything else, it's complicated.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things I got out of that, above all, perhaps even not above all, but like one of the things that stood out to me in that answer was simply that you can critique this power structure that manifests in these patently harmful ways without necessarily even being ad hominem, and so I appreciate that answer. It was very informative. So we had another question come in about how essentially this landscape is changing, and you may have alluded to that again already. But the question is essentially, has toxic masculinity changed? I'm loath to force us to center only on toxic masculinity, but how has toxic masculinity changed? And if so, what kind of impact is that having on the Salton Sea?
Such an interesting question. It's not, you're not forcing us to talk about toxic masculinity. I named the talk that.
Well, I appreciate you.
Is it changing, and does that have an impact? I think that there are more conversations about it happening. I think that sort of the more problematic manifestations of toxic masculinity that have sort of defined our gendered culture for quite a while now, or at least part of the conversation and dialogue at this point, which I think is helpful. Whether or not it's shaping the outcomes of the Salton Sea depends on whether or not, what kinds of priorities get made in the policy of California environmental priorities in the next couple of years. And lawmakers have done a very good job of at least trying to push considerations about the Salton Sea in the right direction, which often means that they are taking, well, in California in general, lawmakers do a better job than other states of taking environmental considerations seriously and taking up issues of conservation. That doesn't mean that they don't get derided for it, for making those kinds of policies and decisions. So I think, unfortunately, again, the answer to that question is also it's complicated. I think that at the moment, the most pressing concern in the area surrounding the Salton Sea at this very moment are the rates of COVID in that part of California are some of the worst in the state. And so getting public health resources to that area, the compounding factors of already existing respiratory health problems, in addition to COVID, to lack of access to healthcare resources, all of those kinds of things are sort of creating those sorts of conditions. And certainly there are gender critiques to be made about all of those policy-based decisions that are happening right now. Do I see things necessarily changing at the moment? We'll see.
I see. Well, I do hope they change for the sake of everyone being impacted. So I think it's almost 1 o'clock. So I think we'll end the conversation there for now. However, I think if anyone has any questions that weren't answered, or if you have any more questions for us, you can go ahead and head to the Inhabiting the Anthropocene blog, where we'll be continuing some further discussions based on what we heard today. But on behalf of the OU College of Medicine Environmental and Sustainable Health Interest Group, I have to say thank you so much for coming and talking to us, Dr. Voyles. This was a pleasure, and I think I learned quite a bit from this talk.
Thank you, Garrett. Your questions were fantastic, and I appreciate the dialogue. So, yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for everybody who joined us today. Go ahead and look for continuing conversation on the blog, and then also look for more conversations coming on in the next coming weeks. So thank you, guys.